of building capacity. And to lead us through today's topic, we have Elizabeth Fussell, who is lead of our capacity building core of Chair C and professor of population studies and environment and society at Brown University. She's also the capacity building, so in addition to being the capacity building core lead for Chair C, she co-directs the institutional initiative called Equitable Climate Futures. And she's a trained sociologist and demographer, spent the last 20 years of her career investigating the effects of environmental shocks, particularly hurricane-related disasters on population mobility and health outcomes. And in our group has really brought a number of social science frameworks in helping us to better understand how we can build transdisciplinary teams and work across these disciplinary boundaries of the particular departments and affiliations that many of us bring when we're trying to come together in building capacity to study the health impacts of extreme weather on aging populations. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Beth, for orienting us to this important topic.
Thank you, Alan. And thanks for those of you who came out on this rainy day, and hello to all of you on Zoom. So this is the first named seminar in the Accelerating Science Colloquium series. We spent last year getting up and running, but this year we have a very exciting program of accelerating science seminars that I think will be very important for all of us who are trying to get on board with doing transdisciplinary and collaborative work around climate, health, and aging. So what I'm going to be doing today is talking about basically the whole seminar, but today's seminar in particular has two objectives. The first is to introduce participants in the meeting to the Chair C research topics and what we call the principles of practice that guide our collaboration. And in today's talk, I'm kind of giving the big picture view of this. In subsequent seminars, we're going to dive really deeply into those approaches that inform our research on climate, health, and aging, and we'll be introducing you to a lot of the new faculty at Brown, and particularly in public health, who have real expertise on climate, health, and aging. Are we all set? Just want to make sure.
Your video is not on.
Okay. Oh. Do I need to change anything? No. Okay. Sorry if we're working through some technical issues here. Sorry, working. There we go. All right, so here's a brief outline of what I'm going to cover today. In the first section of the talk, I'll talk about how climate, health, and aging fit together by referencing some of the frameworks that are well used in this area of research, but aren't often brought together into conversation with one another. And that's what I'm trying to do, to get them into conversation. And then next, I'm going to talk about transdisciplinary team-based collaborative research and what all of those terms mean, because they sound sort of jargon, and they are, and hopefully by the end of today's seminar, everybody will be able to say what we mean by those. Finally, I'm going to end by pointing to some Chair C opportunities that will support progression toward these collaborations. Okay, so Anthony McMichael was an Australian epidemiologist who had a really global historical view of the ways in which climate affects human health. he wrote a book called The Health of Nations. It's a real fabulous read, but it is a book, so it's and it covers a lot of history and space. But he really struggled to develop a framework that would encapsulate all of the ways, the pathways by which climate change translates into human health through all of these different processes and pathways. I do not expect you to be able to read or follow what is written, what is up here. It's mainly meant to illustrate how complex the relationships are between climate change and health. So this framework is published in the 2013 article in the New England Journal of Medicine that I shared out with everybody. What I want to focus our attention on more is the left-hand side of the screen, where what you can see are that there are different categories of risk, where the primary risk categories are all of those causal pathways that directly impact health. These include heat, which is what the initial Chair C research project is investigating, as well as other extreme weather events and air pollution. So air pollution is also part of Chair C, but extreme weather events are not. But there are many more climate risks that indirectly impact health. And McMichael divides these into two categories, the secondary and the tertiary categories. These are often, when you think about what the secondary categories are, these often are risks that are mediated through changes in biological systems. They sort of work at a higher level of societal pathways, and they might in fact affect things like food yields, water, and I think of these as being like they really affect resources, natural resources, and humans' ability to access those vital resources. The tertiary effects are the more diffuse, and they can include things like mental health problems, which we would now call like the post-traumatic stress disorder from a hurricane event or some other type of weather-related disaster. But they can also include things like the way in which these climate impacts unequally impact society by working through the kind of normal pathways that we have that exist in our society. For example, something like residential segregation or other sources of inequality that are compounded by, the effects of those systems are compounded by their interaction with climate impacts. So these are the big ideas that McMichael was talking about. And since he wrote that article, there's been a lot of research that's not drawn on what he proposed, but instead have adapted these two frameworks, the social determinants of health framework and the social vulnerability index, to think about how to try to bring these more familiar frameworks into conversation with climate change. I imagine that the social determinants of health framework is familiar to those of you in public health, and it is similar to what Michael was talking about, the way in which societal institutions and systems, particularly the ones that are highlighted here, like education, healthcare, and economic systems, and then other social contexts like neighborhoods and the built environment, shape health-related outcomes. These are sort of what Bruce Link and Joe Phelan called the upstream or fundamental causes of disease that stand in contrast to more proximate causes of disease. This is what I would call a sociological approach that is the focus of a lot of that focuses on the structural and institutional contexts that shape health outcomes. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have the frameworks that are more commonly used by geographers, particularly human geographers and climate geographers, where they refer to this as a sort of if you look at that equation at the top of this side of the screen, the vulnerability framework, where they think of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity as the three components of vulnerability. And they look at vulnerability as the state of susceptibility to harm, from exposure to stressors associated with environmental and social changes, and the absence of the capacity to adapt to those changes. So when the Social Vulnerability Index is actually on the Center for Disease Control webpage, and it's been adapted from Susan Cutter, who's a geographer. And she and her team took all of the available indicators they could grab, mainly from the Census Bureau, and they did a factor analysis and sort of see which factors held together. And they identified 4 factors in the Social Vulnerability Index that have been widely used to try to understand what makes particular places vulnerable and the people in those places vulnerable. And while this is a widely used and endorsed by health officials and emergency planners, it actually has a lot of problems because it's not really validated, and we shouldn't be using indices that aren't validated with actual studies to try to predict who or what places are vulnerable. But there's enough resonance for this and a need for it that people are still finding it really useful. So I'm not going to say it's not at all valid, but I think that it still needs a lot of investigation to understand how it measures those pathways that McMichael was trying to get at. The next slide is what the US Global Research Program has put together by adapting some of these concepts to in a report called The Impacts of Climate Change on Human Health in the United States. And so what they've done here is the center of this framework takes those the exposure pathways that McMichael was talking about and relating them to health outcomes. And then it adds on either side the way in which institutions and social systems can modify those pathways, and the way that individual and social behaviors may also modify the pathways. I think this is a really useful adaptation of all of those frameworks that came before it. And in fact, it did inspire us at Chair C to use this in our own Chair C framework. Before I move on to that, though, I want to just point out that here, there's no explicit call out of aging and the life course. And so one of the things that we are doing at Chair C and in the Center for Gerontology is trying to get the understanding of life course into this framework. I found this article on aging and life course epidemiology to be really useful to think about all of the different ways in which climate exposures might affect people at different times in their life. I've pointed out here in the top panel the sensitive period model, where what we're focused on is highlighted in orange. It's these exposures that happen in later life that we're looking at to understand how heat in particular affects older adults. But this is not the only way in which climate change affects people at different ages. And so I wanted to point to this article. It's another one of the articles that I shared out with you all. to just highlight the ways in which we can think about how climate change exposures might accumulate over the life course, how they might operate through different pathways at different ages. And then finally, this social mobility model is one that's familiar to a lot of sociologists, where people might cycle in and out of states, for example, poverty, and that cycling in and out of a different kind of state might interact with a climate exposure. So here's the Chair C framework that we've adapted. It's you can see in the central panel the familiar climate driver exposure pathway health impacts and outcomes language that we've adopted. And then on the left-hand panel, we've really integrated the social determinants of health with the vulnerability concepts. And we think about the ways in which different types of exposures and sensitivities and adaptive capacities might modify the pathways between climate change and health. And so we include that panel that says potential for intervention because we acknowledge that those interventions can happen at different points along the exposure pathway. And importantly, we put age in the category of sensitivity. And so this is the way we've put together the research model. And on the right-hand side, we describe the Chair C research topic, where we are looking at the ways in which older adults living in different types of neighborhoods and conditions are exposed to heat and air pollution, and people with older adults and people with chronic conditions are more likely to have a serious problem during a heat wave. So when we're looking for solutions, we look at these sorts of adaptive interventions. This is just a model of how we are thinking about climate impacts on health, but it's a good starting point for anybody who's interested in doing this kind of research to get a handle on the frameworks that are available. Okay, I'm going to pause for a minute. Are there any comments or questions? Yeah.
So question, I'm new to this area, so where does your model fit in the accumulation that you were speaking about from another framework? Where is that in the Chair C model?
Well, so the research project PIs are here, Alan and Teresa, and I would say that at this point, I don't know that they have a variable that would really show accumulation over the life course. I think they're starting with the, here and now. And that is one of the things about heat and air pollution, where the health response to an acute event is going to be pretty short term. There may be past exposures that might make people more vulnerable, but I don't know that there's data on that. And this is one of the issues that when you're trying to wrap your head around a research question, you got to figure out, like, okay, here's our framework. What's our data? What data do we have that can really fill in the concepts that are invoked by the framework?
Betsy has a question.
Hey Beth, hi everybody. I was noticing the other frameworks that you were referencing. One of the differences I saw between the Chair C one and that was that the Chair C one has the adaptive capacity part, which, as you know, I love that there's like an entry point in here to look for, rather than just identifying risk, identifying, what can we do about it? And I wondered, is that unique to this team, or are other teams doing that? Or is this one of these things that that your group came up with kind of uniquely?
Good question. I think there are just so many people thinking about solutions these days and trying to figure out how to, like the name of the series is Accelerating Science, because we want to move more quickly from research questions and results to solutions. And so we are motivated to build those interventions into the framework, but I wouldn't want to claim that we're the first ones to do this. Not that I can think of others who have done it off the top of my head, but I'm sure we got the inspiration from somewhere. Okay, so I'm going to shift now to talk about a second part of the capacity building core and what we aim to do. We wrote into the proposal our principles of practice. And these principles may not be relevant to every single project that Chair C supports, but some of those projects might be very early or they might be limited in scope, but we really would like people who are interested in Chair C and seeking pilot project funding from Chair C to think about how they can build these principles of practice and work toward them if they aren't actually using them yet. So there are 4 here. The first one is transdisciplinarity. And by that, we mean that there are multiple disciplines and community partners who are all working together to design a research project and figure out how to get toward the solutions, which is that last principle, the action-oriented principle of designing research that produces policies and practice that accelerate community resilience. Transdisciplinarity necessarily invokes community engagement, and we have a community engagement core that is developing relationships with partners in Providence who are focused on aging and equity. And that leads to our third principle, which is the focus on equity, in that when we are thinking about research and the sort of solutions that we're pushing toward, we want to always keep in mind the equity principle to make sure that our interventions are available to everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about transdisciplinarity, what we mean by this, because this is a term that people often use without really defining it. And so there's a lot of research, including this report from the National Academy of Sciences, about the science and practice of team science that defines these terms, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary, in these ways, where multidisciplinary is parallel research investigations by disciplines on the same topic, but not in coordination, reading each other's articles, but not necessarily working together. Interdisciplinary means these disciplines, and in this instance, health sciences, climate sciences, and social sciences are working together. They're developing shared mental models and approaches for their investigation. But then finally, transdisciplinary means that there are, in addition to the sciences, you have community partners. And those community partners are fully integrated into the research project so that they're helping to design the questions and the way data is collected and the kinds of solutions that might be drawn from the research findings. Sometimes people use these terms interchangeably, but we are not. We're using them to mean distinct things. Okay, I'm going to switch over to do a little Menti poll so get out your phones and let's see if we can get it up there on the screen. We did a little rehearsal of this beforehand, but So the first question is, as soon as the slide comes up, you'll see the QR code. Do I need to share?
I'm sharing screen. It's just not showing up on here. Okay, that's why.
The first question is just to get a sense of who's in the room, and it's which one of these fields are you coming from? Is it climate, health, social science, or community? There you go. Okay. So, good, people already got in here.
It's not showing up here.
Oh, it's not showing up. Do I
Showing
need
up.
to, can I share my screen to get it to show up?
Do you have it up on your browser?
Okay, very low tech.
I'll get away. But
Yeah, you might have to wander around so everybody
I
can
will,
see QR
I
code
will.
again.
We'll figure it out. We'll get the Menti work better next time.
Mine says, please wait for the presenter to change slides.
Oh,
I already answered.
you already
your
entered.
question.
Yeah, there's one more, there's another slide. So it looks like we mainly have health scientists in the room, but we do have some social scientists and community knowledge partners. Good, the social scientists are adding up. Okay, we have to work harder on getting the climate scientists in the room. Can you move to the next Menti slide? So this question is, have you done interdisciplinary or community engaged research before? And the options are only interdisciplinary, only community engaged, or both. Are people able to use the same QR code to respond? Yeah, okay, good. All right, so it looks like we've got a lot of, so I'm gonna just, we've got 9 people who are saying both, 6 people saying only interdisciplinary, and 2 saying only community engaged. So, so we have our work cut out for us, but there are a fair number of people who in the room, the majority have done both. And so, so that's good, but we need to reach out to people who are at the beginning of doing this and need to get more engaged. Okay, so I'm going to switch back now to my slides, which I think I just did. Okay, so why do we want to do transdisciplinary team-based research? Again, I'm drawing here a lot on what this National Academy of Sciences report has concluded. And I just want to step back a little bit and say, one of the reasons why they wrote this report about team science is because it is an emerging field about which we don't know very much yet, but there's a lot of investment being done in this kind of science. And so studying how it works, what the benefits are, whether or not it really produces better science is still something that needs to be done and something that at least the National Academies is recommending. So why do it? Well, for one, we think that the transdisciplinary science produces better problem framing because you get that input from multiple disciplines who have multiple knowledge bases, as well as community partners who have that real world experience of the problem itself. It leads to better solutions because you understand the context in which those solutions are being designed to solve a problem. And so it also is more responsive to the community partners, keeps them engaged if they see that there's a benefit of participating in research. Furthermore, the recommendations that we come up with are more likely to be used by policymakers and community decision makers. I think this is really critical because they trust the research findings. If they've been part of the research all the way through, they understand how the knowledge was produced and they feel like they have a stake in its production, and so they're going to believe it more. And so it is an important part of our investment in evidence-based policy making to have that trust relationship with the beneficiaries of the policies. Methodological innovations result from transdisciplinary collaborations. Indeed, we all know our own discipline's methodologies, but those methodologies can benefit from borrowing from other disciplines' methodologies. So you might do something new and learn something new as a result. Then finally, these networks of experts and practitioners are better equipped to do even more research. I think that's really an important part of this enterprise, is that these relationships that are being developed have to be long-term. They have to be supported in order to make sure that they continue to contribute to accelerating solutions. And it's a big investment to do team science. So it's great to have a model of supporting it that makes sure that those relationships last beyond the life of a particular grant or a particular PI's career. But transdisciplinary team-based research is not easy. As I was just talking about how these are really long-term relationships, and very few of us actually are able to sustain those kind of long-term relationships as individuals. It really takes a team. I'm just going to say that I've been a part of a lot of interdisciplinary projects, not as many transdisciplinary projects, and I've never been in one that didn't have these initial tensions of like, can we work together? Do we like each other? Do we trust each other? Those are always present in transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary team research. And so it's to be expected. It is not necessarily a sign of failure, it's a sign of growing pains and what you have to work through in order to make sure that you work out a team dynamic that's going to be sustainable. So what are the challenges? Unfamiliarity with other disciplines, key concepts, methods, and literature. Lack of trust, time, and effort necessary for team building. Participants come from different fields and they have different goals, values, and definitions of success. So their incentives to participate in team research differ, and that makes it challenging to persist in the project if those definitions and goals aren't aligned. So what is required is a sustainable funding and staffing model. And that sort of infrastructure around the team is often what carries it through these challenges and makes it persist over a longer period, so that it's not just about one grant, it can be about a whole stream of grants focused on related problems and teams. So I just want to mention that In one of the teams, the interdisciplinary teams that I was a part of, occurred at the University of Maryland at the Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. This was an NSF funded project that was really focused on climate change and solutions. It did not have health as part of the topics that they were tackling, but it did produce a really fabulous website with lots and lots of resources about how to do collaborative team science in this topical area. And so what I didn't realize when I was participating in the project is that our team and all the other teams that had been supported by these grants were being studied by the people who were running the center. And so those observations and all of the kind of data they collected from us actually contributed to the building of this website. So I really strongly recommend those of you who are interested in doing this kind of research to take a look at it and think about using some of those resources yourself. I grabbed some of these topics about cultivating collaboration from Succinct, but also from the National Academy's article, as well as there are a bunch of other articles that treat this topic. The first thing that teams do is define their shared goals and develop a mental model of the problem space or the topic that they want to engage. And what I love about that exercise is that it does help you to identify who the team members should be. You might have people in your discussion group working on a team on developing this mental model of the problem, but you'll see that there's like a gap in expertise that needs to be filled in. And that can help direct you toward identifying who needs to come to the table. So these are all sort of the recommendations for how to do collaborative team science. I'm not going to elaborate them at length here. They're available to look into on the resources that I indicated. But I do want to pull out this last slide this is the last substantive slide, describing this 4-phase model of transdisciplinary research. And what I love about this is that you can really see in the development and the conceptualization stage, as you move around this circle, there's iteration. There's the opportunity to go back and forth. And in the initial stages, that's going to be happening a lot, where people are trying to figure out what their research question is, what data is available that can allow them to answer the question, what expertise they need to answer the question. And it's only after they've gone back and forth about that development and conceptualization that they then can move to implementation. And then finally, once you've got your research results from this point, you might go back and do more development, or you might go to translation. But this is a cycle of research, which is why that kind of sustainable model of transdisciplinary research is so valuable, because it's not a linear progression. You're going to keep going back and forth. And at each stage, I'll also mention that the team composition may change, because you may have different expertise needed at different stages in the research process. Okay, so I'm going to do another Menti, so we'll have to see if we can switch back and forth a little more. So the last one. So here's where, why am I not seeing do you all have the Menti's still open? No, okay. Wish we could get this QR code to show up on my screen. If you can go back to Menti, the question is, what research questions or topics would you like to investigate? And so here the response will be a word cloud, which without it being up on the screen might be hard.
You guys need it again? What research topics?
Yeah, this is. Thank you all for bearing with the technical difficulties.
Trying to focus on Teresa. It's like, oh, you want a portrait of Teresa?
You need several.
That's true. My files.
Okay, so we've got a couple topics up here. We've got outdoor recreation, resilience, community actionable data, structural determinants, older adult health, more resilience. Resilience is getting bigger. Solutions for Rhode Island, disability and aging, infectious disease, networks, disability and aging. Okay. So we'll try to make this slide go into the video. But those are good topics, and we'll take that back, but also to think about how we can address these in future talks. But also it's one way in which we can think about how different people in the group might converge around particular topics. Okay. Before we move to this slide, I just want to say, we've been doing, the mentees are great for getting some ideas up on the page, but does anybody want to say something about like what you all are interested in? Because we have time to talk about this. Yeah.
There's two comments or questions in the chat. So Stefan Gravenstein, does resilience to climate stress differ between populations chronically living in different climate environments?
Is this a question to go in the word cloud or? Yeah.
So I'm just.
Yeah. No, that's great.
Other is integration of climate adaptation and resilience in health systems projects.
Okay. So yeah, so it seems like there is a lot of interest in the solution space, and that's good. And we can then, what we should do is have more conversations about how to connect I think sometimes actually starting with the problem space or the solution, which is related to the solution space, helps us to move backward to then think about what expertise is needed. Any other comments or questions in the room? Okay. So I'm going to plug for the remainder of the what we have going on for the rest of the semester with the Accelerating Science Colloquium. In a month from now, we have Emily Gadbois, who's our Gadbois, here to do, she'll be talking about community engaged research from partnership to practice. And then Alan Just, who's also here, is going to talk about modeling exposure to heat for human health studies. And in January, Teresa Shireman is going to talk about pathways from extreme heat to adverse health outcomes for older adults. So that is the Chairs C leadership team. You will have heard from all of us by January. And then for the remainder of the spring semester, we're going to hear from some of the other faculty in public health who are working in climate and health and aging spaces, particularly Mariantiana okay, I'm not going to try to say your name, but Marianti, Rachel Baker, and Corey Ziegler are all going to be speaking in the spring semester. And we're going to end the semester with the Chairs C Unconference. And I want to say a little bit about what the Unconference is, because that is an Unconference is an event where people come together to have a unstructured, it's not a previously structured event. When you arrive at the conference, you design the agenda for the conference through your own interests. And so the first meeting of the conference is everybody getting their ideas out on the table. And then people who want each of those ideas is assigned to a room and a time, and everybody interested in talking about that topic goes to meet together to discuss how they can collaborate around that topic. I'm really hopeful that throughout the year, people attending this series will start getting to know each other. We'll have a little more conversation, and people will begin identifying some of those ideas that they can really then elaborate either at the Unconference or on their own in their own conversations. We also have a pilot project funding program where we will be, Jennifer Tidy and I run this, and we're on the 16th of October, we're going to have a virtual only session in which we talk about writing effective pilot project proposals. And we have a letter of intent due date, which is really meant for us to help you. So if you send in a letter of intent with a team of people who are interested in collaborating around a climate, health, and aging topic, we can help you to figure out how you can, you tell us what you still need, and we can try to connect you with the person who can fill that gap. Those proposals are due in January, and so you'll have plenty of time between the letter of intent and the due date for the proposal to get your ideas together. The funds are pretty generous for the selected proposals. I want to indicate that we are really encouraging people to do transdisciplinary research and interdisciplinary research. So you can apply it if you're in a single department, and you'll be eligible for up to 50K for 1 year. You can get, if you have 2 disciplines involved, you're eligible for 75K for a year of research. And if you involve a community partner, you can get 25K on top of what you're eligible for as an academic team. This is obviously meant to incentivize transdisciplinary and community engaged work. We also have a grant project launcher that's on our website that you can access anytime and do basically what we're trying to do with that letter of intent, which is you tell us what you want to research, and we can give you feedback about what resources are available and how we might help you put together a team that can tackle the research question that you're interested in. So I'd encourage you to take a look at our website and to engage with it. It will constantly be updated as we have more events and other sorts of information being that we want to distribute to those of you who are interested in working in this space. right, any questions about opportunities? Any questions online? Okay, then I'll conclude by giving you, whoops, the last QR code, which is just give us some feedback about what you learned today and how you think this session went, what you'd like to see more of in the future. Thank you very much.